They say old buildings carry echoes of the past, footsteps that shouldn't be heard, whispers that belong to the walls. When Emma moved into her new apartment, she thought the creaking floors and flickering lights were just part of its charm. But late one night, standing in the dim hallway, she met a woman who changed everything. A woman with a tragic sadness in her eyes. A woman who claimed she was already dead. In a crumbling century-old apartment building tucked into the corner of a dimly lit street, Emma moved in on a gray autumn afternoon. Her life was quiet, her job demanding, and she relished the solitude. That was until she met Claire. Claire was a pale, melancholic woman who lived in the apartment opposite Emma's. She had the aura of someone carrying a deep sorrow. Their interactions began small, a polite nod in the hallway, a brief conversation about the unpredictable heating system, and eventually, longer talks over coffee. Claire always seemed hesitant, her words carefully chosen, and her eyes often darting toward darkened corners of the hallway. Emma noticed how Claire never invited her into her apartment, and if Emma offered to visit, she was met with a nervous laugh and a change of topic. Still, Emma liked Claire's company and appreciated the bond they were forming. One stormy night, as rain lashed against the windows and thunder growled in the distance, Emma heard a knock. Opening the door, she found Claire standing there, soaked and visibly shaken. "Can I come in?" Claire asked. Emma nodded, guiding her inside and handing her a warm blanket. Claire sat on the worn couch, her hands trembling. "You're the only one who talks to me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Emma frowned. "That's not true. I'm sure others—" "No." Claire cut her off, shaking her head. "They can't see me." Emma chuckled nervously, thinking it was a joke, but Claire's expression remained grave. "I need to tell you something," Claire continued. "It's about this building. About me." What followed sent a chill down Emma's spine. Claire recounted how, 3 years ago, she had been living in the same apartment Emma now occupied. She described a series of unnerving events, objects moving on their own, strange whispers at night, and the feeling of being watched. Then, one night, she was murdered, strangled in her bed by an unseen force. "I never left," Claire said, her voice cracking. "I'm trapped here, because I need someone to know what happened." Emma felt the room grow colder, the air thick with tension. She forced a nervous laugh. "That's quite a story, Claire. But you're here. You're alive, right?" Claire shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. "Number, I'm not." Before Emma could respond, Claire stood and walked to the door. "You don't believe me, but you will." The door shut quietly behind her, but Emma felt the silence that followed press against her like a weight. The next morning, Emma decided to investigate. She asked her landlord about Claire, describing her appearance in detail. The landlord frowned, shaking his head. "No one's lived in that apartment in years," he said. Emma insisted, but he pulled out the tenant log to show her. The last tenant in Claire's apartment was, indeed, named Claire. She had been found dead in her bed 3 years ago. The cause of death was officially ruled a heart attack, though some whispered it was something far more sinister. Emma spent the rest of the day in a haze, questioning her own sanity. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard it, the faint sound of knocking on her door. Gathering her courage, she opened it to find no one there. But as she stepped back inside, the air grew icy, and the lights flickered. She turned to see Claire standing in the middle of the room, her face a mask of sorrow. "You know the truth now," Claire said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "But you're not safe." The words hung heavy in the air as a shadow began to materialize behind Claire, tall, menacing, and devoid of features. Claire turned, her expression one of terror. "Run!" she screamed. Emma bolted out of the apartment, her heart pounding. She didn't stop until she was out on the street, the cold air biting her skin. Emma never returned to the building. She packed her belongings with the help of friends during the day, avoiding the apartment at all costs. She later learned that others in the building had reported strange occurrences over the years, but nothing was ever confirmed. Claire's story haunted her. She often wondered if she could have done more to help, or if the shadow Claire feared was now stalking someone else in that cursed building. Emma moved far away, but every so often she'd wake up to the sound of faint knocking on her door, the memory of Claire's tragic face fresh in her mind. Years later, Emma would tell herself it was all in her mind, a trick of loneliness and fear. But late at night, in the silence of her new home, she would still hear it. A faint knock, a whisper of her name, and the cold sensation of someone watching. And she wondered, not if Claire had left that apartment, but if something else had followed her. Emma never forgot the chilling events in that apartment. She carried Claire's sorrow like an unshakable shadow, the memory of her haunting presence forever etched into her mind. Emma often wondered if Claire had been freed, or if the sinister force that had taken her life still lingered. Though she moved far away, Emma remained hyper-aware of every creak, every shadow, and every knock at the door. Some nights, she'd bolt upright in bed, her pulse racing, convinced she could feel cold fingers trailing down her arm, or hear faint whispers calling her name. In the end, Emma realized that some stories don't end. They simply wait for someone new to listen. The snow fell in thick, muffling sheets, blanketing the forest in an unnatural quiet. The Callahan family's SUV crunched up the long, icy driveway, the headlights slicing through the dense gloom. Ahead, the cabin loomed, a shadowy silhouette against the stark white backdrop, its windows like hollow eyes staring into the cold. They were seeking a Christmas retreat, a chance to escape the noise of the city and reconnect. But as they stepped through the creaking door, a biting chill seeped into their bones, a cold far deeper than the winter air. None of them noticed the faint, bloody handprint smeared on the inside of the frosted window. The cabin stood deep in the heart of the forest, a relic of the 1800s with its weathered wooden walls and frost-bitten windows. It was nestled against a frozen lake, the surrounding trees gnarled and skeletal against the pale winter sky. For the Callahan family, it seemed perfect, secluded, serene, and untouched by time. The father, Mark, unloaded the luggage, while his wife, Lisa, ushered their two children, 10-year-old Emily and her teenage brother, Sam, inside. The air smelled of pine and ice. Inside, the cabin was quaint but cold, with a stone fireplace, heavy wooden furniture, and a faint, inexplicable scent of decay that Mark dismissed as old wood. By nightfall, the cabin had warmed up, the crackling fire spreading an orange glow across the living room. The family laughed and played board games as snow piled outside, sealing them off from the world. But the laughter was interrupted when Emily gasped, clutching her ears. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. The family paused, listening. Nothing but the wind. "Just the wind, sweetheart," Lisa reassured her. But as the night wore on, the whispers became harder to ignore. They seemed to seep from the very walls, faint voices murmuring in unison, their tone mournful. Sam, ever the skeptic, pressed his ear to the wall. "It's probably the pipes," he said, though his voice betrayed unease. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only the creak of settling wood. The following day, Sam explored the attic. He returned with a faded, leather-bound diary he found tucked under a loose floorboard. It belonged to Margaret Holloway, who had lived in the cabin with her family over a century ago. The entries began cheerfully, describing snowy days and family dinners. But the final pages were frantic, written in trembling handwriting. "They are coming. They want us to join them." Mark dismissed it as a spooky tale, but Lisa couldn't shake the unease. That night, as the family slept, Emily woke up screaming. She claimed to see shadows moving in her room, their shapes flickering against the walls like distorted marionettes. When Lisa rushed in, the window was wide open, snow blowing inside, though they were certain it had been locked. The whispers grew louder the following night, no longer mournful, but angry. The family discovered bloody handprints on the windows and door frames, as if something had tried to claw its way inside. Sam found an old, rusted knife in the cellar with dried blood still encrusting the blade. Lisa called the police, but the line was dead, The car wouldn't start, and the snowstorm had made leaving on foot impossible. That night, they saw them, the Holloways. The family appeared as translucent figures in period clothing, their faces pale and bloodied. They stood in the living room, motionless except for their eyes, which stared directly at the Callahans. When Mark tried to speak to them, the figures lunged forward with unnatural speed before vanishing into the walls. The Callahans pieced together the story. The Holloways had been murdered by their deranged father on Christmas Eve, their blood staining the snow outside the cabin. Their spirits were trapped, reliving their final moments endlessly. Emily, drawn to the attic one night, found a small wooden doll smeared with blood. "They don't want to hurt us," she whispered in a trance. "They just want to share." Lisa pulled her away, but the cabin was no longer just a structure. It breathed, groaned, and thrummed with energy, locking them inside. The walls bled sap-like fluid, and the windows reflected not their faces, but those of the Holloways. Christmas Eve arrived. The Callahans decided to confront the spirits, gathering in the living room with candles and the rusted knife. They recited prayers and demanded the Holloways release them. The ghosts appeared again, but this time, their movements were violent and erratic. Objects flew across the room. The fire turned an unnatural blue. The cabin itself seemed to warp, the walls elongating and folding inward. The Holloways screamed in unison, a piercing sound that rattled bones. In the chaos, Emily vanished, her voice echoing from the attic. Mark and Lisa found her standing in the corner, her eyes vacant. "They say we can stay," she whispered, "forever." By Christmas morning, the Callahans were gone. The cabin stood silent and untouched, as if no one had ever been there. Days later, another family arrived, drawn by the promise of a quaint holiday getaway. The cycle began anew. Weeks later, the cabin sat untouched, silent beneath a heavy blanket of snow. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying faint echoes of laughter and screams, entwined like a twisted melody. Inside, the air was still, the fireplace cold, yet the faint outline of footsteps, small and large, trailed across the dusty floor, leading nowhere. A single tiny wooden doll sat upright in the center of the room, its painted eyes staring blankly at the door. Far off in the distance, the crunch of tires on fresh snow broke the silence. Another family had arrived. The cabin waited. The Callahans were absorbed into the cycle of the cabin, their identities dissolved into the fabric of its curse. Mark, Lisa, Sam, and Emily became part of the Holloways' eternal torment, their spirits bound to relive that cursed Christmas night over and over. Each of them took on roles in the grim tableau. Mark became a shadow in the walls, his anguished cries blending with the whispers that haunted the cabin. Lisa's spectral form wandered aimlessly, clutching at phantom doors that would never open. Sam's laughter echoed unnaturally in empty rooms, distorted into a chilling mockery. Emily, the youngest and most innocent, stood forever at the attic window, her face a pale reflection in the frost, her tiny hand pressed against the glass. She watched, waiting, as new families arrived to play their part in the cabin's endless horror. They didn't simply disappear, they became forgotten, erased from the world outside, their existence remembered only by the cursed cabin itself.